When Victoria Ashworth pressed both hands flat against the boardroom table and let that slow, dismissive laugh roll across the room, every executive on the 32nd floor understood exactly what she meant. "You'll never quit, Daniel," she said, her voice carrying the sharp edge of someone who had never once doubted her own power. "A single father like you needs the paycheck I sign." Daniel Marsh didn't argue. He looked at her, unclipped his badge from around his neck, and walked back to his desk. Minutes later, Renee Foster, the company's general counsel, came rushing down the corridor, her face strained of color, about to ask the one question that would unravel everything Victoria believed she controlled. Before that moment, though, it helps to understand the world Daniel worked in not as a physical space, but as an ecosystem with its own invisible hierarchy. Who belonged, who was merely tolerated, and who would always be treated as an outsider no matter how long they stayed. The 32nd floor of Ashworth Logistics and Freight's headquarters held corner suites that caught the morning sun before anywhere else in the building. The private dining room off the executive corridor served a rotating menu 3 mornings a week that no one outside that floor had ever seen. Every Monday, the people who ran the company pulled up in cars worth more than most people earned in a decade, tossing the keys to valets who recognized each vehicle before it finished turning the corner. It was a world built to remind everyone who entered it exactly how far they stood from the people who had built it. Daniel drove a 9-year-old pickup truck, parked it himself 3 levels underground in the general employee garage, and rode the same elevator as the mailroom staff and janitors. He wore shirts from discount outlets, carried a watch his late wife had given him before her illness, and packed his lunch before sunrise while his daughter got ready for school. He'd been director of operations at Ashworth for 6 years. In that time, he never joined the executive team for their preferred dinners, never attended the charity galas that functioned as expensive networking events, and never lifted a finger to court the people whose opinions shaped his career. He simply came in early, caught operational problems before they became crises, and kept the logistics backbone of a major freight company running so reliably that colleagues had stopped even commenting on it. Victoria had inherited the company from her father at 31 and rebuilt it in her own image, fast, acquisition-hungry, and utterly confident in its own judgment. She wasn't without real talent, her instincts for deals were genuine, and the revenue growth under her leadership was measurable. But she'd also grown up believing that the people who served her needs were interchangeable, that loyalty was something you bought with a paycheck, and that a person's freedom was defined by how much cushion they had to absorb the fallout of exercising it. When she looked at Daniel, she saw a man with a mortgage, a teenage daughter to raise alone, medical debt from his late wife's illness, and no family money waiting in the wings. In her calculus, that made him permanent. Not because he was irreplaceable, but because his circumstances had sealed every exit. She never said this outright. Powerful people rarely do, they prefer their contempt to stay invisible while still doing its job. At a strategy session, she'd remarked in front of 9 colleagues that someone with Daniel's family obligations would naturally struggle to sustain the ambition senior leadership required. At a retreat, she noted that certain directors were better suited to roles with defined boundaries and steady predictability. Whenever Daniel asked for flexibility around his daughter's medical appointments, the approval came wrapped in a silence that turned ordinary courtesy into something closer to a favor she could call in whenever she needed his compliance. Everything came to a head during the quarterly operations review. Daniel had put together dozens of pages of careful analysis showing that Victoria's proposed budget cut would leave 3 of the company's biggest distribution hubs dangerously exposed right as peak season approached. He walked the room through the numbers without drama, offered the data for scrutiny, and waited for the kind of real engagement this room had never quite given him. Victoria let him finish. Then she turned to the assembled leadership and asked, with total composure, whether Daniel's objections came from genuine concern for the company or from private anxiety about his own job being cut. No one breathed. Daniel said his concerns were in the data, that he'd document them formally so the record reflected his position, and he did 3 separate, thorough submissions before he left the building that night. The meeting Victoria called 2 days later was listed on the calendar as a conversation about departmental alignment. What Daniel walked into was something far more staged. Every senior leader on the floor had gathered around the table. Martin Hayes, the CFO, sat with his hands folded with deliberate care. Legal sat on either side of the room. Victoria stood at the head of the table with the posture of someone who'd already decided the outcome and called the meeting purely for show. Daniel took the one open chair, set his folder down, and waited. The stillness in the room wasn't the uncertain quiet of a meeting whose direction hadn't been set, it was the quiet of people who already knew what was coming and had each decided, individually, not to be the one who stopped it. Victoria opened by presenting the restructuring as finalized rather than up for discussion. When Daniel raised the same 3 operational risks from his written reports, she cut him off before his second point, insisting the modeling was too conservative and ignored contractual flexibility with carriers, rebuttals delivered with total confidence she hadn't bothered to verify, and no one at the table corrected her. Having run out of professional ground to stand on, Victoria shifted into territory no one expected a CEO to enter in a formal leadership meeting. She mentioned, with practiced casualness, that Daniel carried a heavy mortgage. That his daughter was nearing college age and those costs weren't small. That he had no private wealth, no family safety net, nothing beyond the paycheck Ashworth gave him each month. None of it was false. All of it was aimed with the precision of someone who'd calculated exactly where each point would land. When she'd laid it all out, she pulled it together into one line: "Don't pretend you have options, Daniel." The quiet in the room changed after that, not professional silence anymore, but the specific stillness of people who sense they're witnessing something they'll remember for a long time. Martin studied his hands. The lawyers studied the table. Daniel looked at Victoria and asked, without any rise in his voice or any trace of wounded pride, whether she was telling him he had to endorse a decision he believed would hurt the business simply because his paycheck gave her leverage over him. Victoria smiled and said she was simply pointing out that he wasn't walking away from compensation like this anytime soon. Then she delivered the line that would define everything after: if he thought he was worth so much, he should go ahead and quit. The challenge landed like something dropped from a height, and everyone at the table understood exactly what it was. Not a disagreement that had gotten out of hand, but a deliberate, public assertion of dominance meant to settle, once and for all, who held the power in that relationship. She expected what powerful people always expect from a challenge like that: retreat, a professionally worded apology, or the particular silence of someone who's just been shown the limits of their own leverage. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, long enough to make everyone in the room uncomfortable. He wasn't angry. He wasn't visibly rattled. He looked, as closely as anyone there could later describe it, completely calm. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, said 2 words, "All right," and walked toward the door at a pace that told everyone he had no intention of slowing down. No one moved after Daniel left. People who were there later described the strange sensation of watching something they couldn't quite process. A man walking away from the kind of standoff that, in their experience, always eventually resolved the expected way. Victoria stayed at the head of the table, wearing the expression of someone waiting for a punchline she'd already heard, certain the setup would land exactly where she expected. She assumed he'd gone to his desk to cool off, to let the weight of his obligations reassert itself over the emotion of the moment, to run the same calculation she'd already run on his behalf and arrive at the only answer she believed his life allowed. He'd take some time. He'd come back. She was sure of it. What Daniel was actually doing at his desk was opening the bottom drawer. He pulled out a framed photo of his daughter at around 12, laughing at something outside the frame, and set it carefully into a cardboard box he'd grabbed from the supply closet. He added a chipped mug he'd used every morning for years, 3 worn notebooks, and a fountain pen from his bag. Each item went in with the quiet deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed this moment so many times in his head that the physical act required no thought at all. He unhooked his jacket from his chair, folded it over the box, picked it up, and turned to log out of his computer. Pay attention to what he did next, because it says more than it seems to. Daniel moved every active project file into the team's official handover folder, following the formal departure process to the letter, nothing missing, nothing deleted, nothing belonging to the company leaving the building with him. Through her office window, Victoria stood watching without moving. Co-workers near their desks practiced the art of not quite staring while watching completely. The easiest form of payback available to him in that moment would have been chaos, missing files, sloppy handoffs, the mess of someone who wanted the company to feel his absence like an injury. He chose instead to leave everything exactly as it needed to be for whoever came next. He left like a professional, the same way he'd shown up every day for 6 years. Victoria crossed the floor as he lifted the box. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Home," Daniel said. "And tomorrow?" Something new had crept into that question, not quite alarm, but the first crack in a certainty starting to give way. "I won't be coming back," he said. He reached back with his free hand, set his badge on the desk without ceremony, and that was when Renee Foster came through the stairwell door at the far end of the floor. She'd been a level down when her assistant told her Daniel was packing up, and she arrived wearing the look attorneys get when something has already gone badly wrong and the damage is still unfolding. She looked at the box under his arm, at the badge on the desk, at Victoria, and asked in a deliberately level voice, "Tell me you didn't just let Daniel Marsh walk out of this building." Victoria said he hadn't been let go, he'd chosen to leave. Renee said the distinction was noted, then asked the question that changed the temperature of the entire floor: was he the principal behind the Meridian licensing agreement? Because if he was, this wasn't a resignation. It was a very different kind of problem. To understand why Renee's face had gone pale that fast, you have to go back 7 years, to a time when Ashworth Logistics wasn't the confident, acquisition-hungry company Victoria had built it into. Back then, the company was hemorrhaging money for reasons that didn't trace to any single cause. The routing network hadn't been meaningfully updated in over a decade. Carrier capacity sat wasted across thousands of miles every month. Distribution centers had been placed for demand patterns that barely matched reality anymore. Fuel costs per delivered unit ran well above industry average. A gap that, multiplied across a national fleet, produced losses steep enough to worry even a board used to leaning on the Ashworth name. The fix came from an unlikely place, a small, privately owned company called Marsh Dynamics, and a logistics platform its founder had built from scratch, called the Meridian Routing Platform. The pilot ran 18 months, and the results weren't marginal. Idle vehicle time dropped by nearly a third, fuel costs fell at a rate the CFO at the time wouldn't fully believe until it had held for 3 straight quarters, and real-time cargo redistribution became possible in a way the old system had never approached. When the board pushed to buy the technology outright, Daniel said no. He'd license Meridian to Ashworth and join the company himself to oversee its rollout, but ownership would stay with Marsh Dynamics, governed by a formal licensing deal rather than any transfer of rights. Ashworth agreed. Over the years, most people inside the company mentally blurred the line between "we license this from Marsh Dynamics" and "this belongs to us because Daniel works here." The contract never said those were the same thing. Not once. Renee read the key provisions aloud from her tablet while Victoria stood at one end of the table and Martin sat at the other, practiced in the particular stillness of a man who decided not to speak until asked directly. The clause that mattered most was a 90-day transition window built into the original agreement. If Daniel ever left the company for any reason, Ashworth kept full access to Meridian in its current form for 90 days, during which Marsh Dynamics remained obligated to provide standard support. After that, all further development, the proprietary modules Meridian had absorbed over its years inside Ashworth, reverted to open commercial renegotiation between 2 independent companies. No automatic renewal. No guaranteed access. Terms set by the other side, at whatever price and under whatever conditions they chose. "So we renegotiate," Victoria said, with the brisk certainty of someone who believed every problem eventually reduced to leverage. Renee said that was certainly an option, but noted, with the precision lawyers use when the answer is unwelcome, that Ashworth had spent 6 years building its operational backbone entirely around Meridian. 3 of the company's major distribution networks ran core routing exclusively on Meridian's modules, and the real-time optimization that multiple enterprise clients had cited by name as a reason for choosing Ashworth was Meridian-powered. Pulling Meridian out wasn't like removing a piece of equipment, it was closer to pulling the frame out of a building built around it. The structure would technically still stand, but everything resting on that frame would need to be rebuilt. "Then we offer him more money," Victoria said. Martin studied his hands. Renee said that option existed too, but pointed out, quietly and without theatrics, that Victoria had just spent an afternoon telling Daniel, in front of 6 witnesses, that the company didn't need him and that his presence had only ever been a function of his lack of options. "You made it personal," Renee said. And the person now sitting across the table in that renegotiation is someone whose feelings about this company haven't exactly improved in the last 90 minutes. Victoria went home that night carrying the settled belief that Daniel would be at his desk by morning. It wasn't wishful thinking, it was a theory about people that had served her well throughout her career. People under financial pressure made dramatic gestures when their pride was bruised, then recalibrated once the weight of their obligations reasserted itself. She'd watched that pattern play out enough times to treat it as predictable. Daniel had a mortgage, a daughter depending on him, no savings cushion, and no obvious alternative to the income she provided. She'd already done the math on his behalf, and the math only had one answer. Morning came and his chair was empty. No jacket over the back of it, no light showing an active session on his monitor, no sign of him at the break room near his desk. The emptiness held through the late morning. One of his direct reports walked past his desk twice, stopping the second time with the unmistakable look of someone whose assumptions had just been proven wrong. By early afternoon, HR had received a formal resignation letter, along with a transition packet so thorough that the HR director, Harold Briggs, later told his team it was the most complete departure documentation he'd seen in over 2 decades on the job. This detail says everything about what had really happened in that conference room 2 days earlier. The resignation letter had been written before that meeting ever took place. The handover documentation had been assembled over months. Indexed by project, sorted by urgency, covering every active initiative, every vendor contact, every operational flag that would need attention in the weeks after he left. Daniel hadn't walked out of that room and made an impulsive choice. He'd been preparing to leave for a long time, quietly and methodically, waiting either for the right moment or for the situation to make staying impossible. Victoria's challenge hadn't caused his departure. It had simply ended the patience he'd been holding on to while he finished getting ready. Martin came to Victoria's office that afternoon carrying a folder and the look of a man who'd rehearsed what he was about to say more than once. He told her he'd reviewed all 3 of Daniel's formal reports and that the modeling behind each one held up. The proposed cut, if it went through on schedule, would create exactly the bottleneck Daniel had warned about, and peak season was now just weeks away. He warned us, Martin said. Victoria said Daniel should have pushed harder. Martin set the folder on her desk and said nothing else. Between the 3 reports, it held well over 100 pages of documented analysis. The call from Julian Cross came that afternoon. Julian ran Cross Global Retail, whose contract with Ashworth represented several $100 million in annual revenue, and he didn't call the CEO's direct line for routine matters. His assistant had flagged it urgent. When Victoria picked up, Julian skipped the pleasantries and asked one question: was Daniel Marsh still the operational lead on the Cross account? Victoria gave a careful answer about organizational transitions and service continuity. The pause that followed said more than any words could have. Then Julian, in the measured tone of someone who'd run a multi-billion-dollar company for over a decade and didn't waste language, said, "Then we have a problem." Victoria told her assistant afterward that Julian was applying pressure, not signaling real intent to leave, that contracts this size didn't evaporate over a personnel change, and she knew the difference between a client posturing and a client actually reconsidering. She wasn't wrong that it wouldn't happen in a single afternoon. She was wrong about almost everything else. Before the week was out, 2 more enterprise clients had reached out to Ashworth's accounts team asking for written confirmation about Meridian's continuity in their service agreements. For the first several days after Daniel left, Victoria operated on an assumption that had held reliably for most of her career, that the Ashworth name was the primary thing clients were paying for. The company had operated for nearly 80 years. Its infrastructure was real and substantial. No single director, however capable, was truly irreplaceable inside an organization of this size carrying this name. It was a defensible position in theory. In the specific situation now unfolding around her, it turned out to be completely wrong, and the proof arrived steadily, one piece at a time. Julian arranged a formal call with Ashworth's leadership later that week, bringing his own COO and logistics director. Victoria led for Ashworth. The call opened with the composure that major client relationships usually sustain through their first few minutes, then turned direct within 10. Julian had decided there was something Ashworth's leadership needed to understand, and he intended to deliver it with the clarity a nine-figure relationship deserved. Years earlier, during a supply chain crisis that had paralyzed freight networks across the country, cross-global retail had been staring down catastrophic holiday delivery failures. At their scale, missing those windows meant hundreds of millions in lost revenue and lasting damage to customer relationships. What had prevented that outcome wasn't Ashworth's infrastructure, or any corporate protocol, or the Ashworth name. Daniel had worked 2 straight nights alongside Cross's operations team and Ashworth's own distribution staff, recalculating routes through Meridian and coordinating solutions to a situation no existing emergency plan covered, because none had ever been built for a disruption that size. No one had asked him to do it. He got no extra pay for it. He'd simply seen a problem that needed fixing and stayed until it was fixed. Victoria hadn't been part of those 2 nights. The Ashworth brand hadn't shown up in any functional sense. What had shown up, for 2 nights straight, was one person's commitment and the system he'd spent years building. "My relationship with this company rests on the people who deliver what they promise," Julian said on the call. "The person who delivered most consistently, when it mattered most, is no longer there." Victoria offered assurances about the depth of Ashworth's broader leadership bench. Julian thanked her and let her know his legal team would be reviewing next year's renewal timeline. By the end of that week, a second enterprise client had put its own renewal on hold, and a third sent formal correspondence asking for written assurance about Meridian's continuity. A contract extension worth hundreds of millions, 3 signatures from being finalized, was suddenly under review. Victoria called Daniel that week. He didn't answer. She called again a few days later. Still nothing. The voicemail she left, not quite landing the warmth she was going for, said they needed to talk. What came back was a text routed through his contact information. "All matters concerning the Meridian platform and Marsh dynamics should go through the firm's legal representative, name and number attached." No greeting, no acknowledgement of her voicemail, no trace of wounded pride or any need for recognition, none of the emotional leverage she'd been counting on. What she got instead was the commercial equivalent of a door closed, locked, and handed off to legal. Eleanor Voss, the board's independent chair, sent a calendar invite within hours of that last client notification. Subject line: Emergency Board Session, Operational Risk Review. The boardroom sat 1 floor above Victoria's office, and on the morning of that session, that single floor of difference carried more weight than any blueprint could explain. Eleanor was already seated when Victoria arrived, already at the head of the table, already holding the full agenda. 3 bound documents sat in front of every board member's seat, clearly prepared well before the meeting was even announced. Eleanor had spent nearly 2 decades as an independent board chair and had a specific method for the hardest sessions: no raised voices, no visible emotion, nothing asserted that wasn't already backed by paper on the table. She asked each member to confirm they'd reviewed the materials. They confirmed. Then she turned to Victoria. The 3 documents were the original Meridian licensing agreement, the compiled record of Daniel's 3 formal warnings about the budget cut, and a client impact summary Renee's team had put together over the previous days, detailing the revenue now in question and the specific concerns raised by clients since Daniel's departure. Eleanor asked, with no softening and no diplomatic hedging, who had made the decision to part ways with Daniel Marsh. Victoria said no decision had been made, that Daniel chose to resign on his own. Renee, present as general counsel, gave a factual account of the conference room exchange, the exact language used, the challenge issued, the 6 witnesses present, and everything that followed. Victoria said issuing a challenge wasn't the same as forcing a resignation. Eleanor nodded and said the legal distinction had been noted, but wasn't the point of this meeting. What followed wasn't a dramatic confrontation. It was far more methodical than that, which made it much harder to deflect. Eleanor went through each of Daniel's 3 formal warnings in order, asking each time why the concerns hadn't been escalated to the board. Victoria said she hadn't believed the projections warranted it. Eleanor asked if she'd reviewed the underlying methodology. Victoria said she'd reviewed a summary. Eleanor asked who prepared that summary. It turned out a member of Victoria's own staff had built it around assumptions aligned with the outcome Victoria wanted, and Martin confirmed this without being asked, having reached the point where defending Victoria's version of events cost more than telling the truth. Martin then walked the board through the numbers. The combined value of the three major contracts now in question topped several $100 million over a 2-year period, a figure that didn't even include the secondary damage, the reputational cost of clients watching how Ashworth handled its own operational relationships under pressure, the competitive disadvantage of a worse Meridian licensing deal, and the cost of emergency outside contracting during the transition. These weren't guaranteed outcomes, Martin noted. They were measurable risks, and they hadn't been created by market conditions or competition or any outside force, just one exchange in a conference room on an ordinary morning. Eleanor looked at Victoria for a long moment before speaking. You told this man, in those exact words, in front of 6 witnesses, that he needed this company and that this company didn't need him. I'd like to understand, with some precision, which of those 2 statements the evidence currently supports. Victoria had no answer that the past several days hadn't already made obsolete. The room stayed quiet. No one at that table was willing to answer for her, because everyone there already knew the answer, and knew that everyone else knew it too. The meeting Victoria eventually arranged with Daniel happened almost 2 weeks after he'd carried a cardboard box to the elevator. She'd expected to hold it in her office, assuming, without quite examining the assumption, that the old geography of their working relationship would do some of the work for her, that the building and everything it represented would create the conditions she needed. Daniel declined the location. He suggested a small coffee shop a few blocks from the Marsh Dynamics office, wooden chairs, no staff hovering, no one who'd recognize either of them or care what they were discussing. Victoria arrived early, which was unusual for her. Daniel arrived on time, set a glass of water on the table without ordering anything, and sat down without a trace of the tension or restrained anger she'd expected. He looked, and this was the detail that unsettled her most, like a man who'd been sleeping just fine. She opened by acknowledging that the conference room exchange hadn't matched the professional standards she claimed to hold the company to. Careful, legally cautious language, admitting to a general failure of tone while committing to nothing specific. Daniel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded once and said nothing. She offered a substantial raise, expanded authority, and a formal seat on the executive committee. He said no. She asked if there were terms that might work. He said that wasn't really the question. She raised the offer significantly, adding a performance bonus tied to revenue and a dedicated engineering team under his authority focused entirely on Meridian. He turned it down in the same even tone, with no visible sign the number had created any internal conflict at all. Victoria leaned forward and offered even more, stock vesting over 4 years and a title she invented on the spot, one that would have put him among the 5 most senior people in the company. She watched for the reaction large numbers reliably produce in people who've spent years wondering what their principles are worth. The slight recalibration. The pause. The tell of someone starting to reconsider. Daniel's expression didn't move. He looked at her with something that was hardest of all to sit with, not triumph, not contempt, not the satisfaction of someone savoring a reversal. Something quieter than all of that. The settled calm of a person who'd made peace with his decision long enough ago that no number on the table came anywhere close to what he was actually protecting. That's exactly the problem, he said. You still think this is about money. She started to respond, and he kept going, without raising his voice. He told her he'd never needed wealth from that job. What he'd needed was a workplace where a documented, data-backed concern got engaged with seriously instead of turned into a way to humiliate the person who raised it. He'd needed to be able to show up for his daughter without that being held against him as proof he was somehow less capable. He'd needed the basic respect of being treated as someone whose judgment mattered, not as a liability that happened to be manageable for now. None of that was for sale at any price she could name, because money had never been the thing she'd actually damaged. You'll come back, Victoria said, with noticeably less certainty than she'd had 2 weeks earlier. People in your situation always need stability eventually. Daniel picked his jacket up off the back of the chair and looked at her one last time. Not with hostility, not with quiet satisfaction, just the plain, uncomplicated look of someone who'd long since stopped needing anyone in that room to understand him. You still don't get it, he said. Then he left the coffee shop the same way he'd left the conference room 2 weeks earlier, unhurried, no performance, and without looking back. The board's response played out over the following weeks, and it's worth being precise about what it actually was. There was no dramatic ousting, no public announcement, no sudden empty office on the 32nd floor. That wasn't how Eleanor Voss handled institutional consequences, and in her judgment, it wasn't what the situation called for. What it called for was a targeted, permanent reduction of the specific authority that had caused the problem. The kind of consequence that can't be spun through any single dramatic act, because its weight comes precisely from being both permanent and visible to everyone watching it happen. Victoria kept her title. She kept her office, her name on the letterhead, and the pay that came with both. What she lost was the unchecked ability to make major operational decisions without board review. Every proposed change to the distribution network, every director-level personnel decision, every significant contract now required pre-approval through the board's operations committee, chaired by Eleanor. Her annual bonus was suspended until the client contracts in question were resolved. All of it was delivered in a session that lasted under an hour, without malice or theater, in language precise enough to leave no room for reinterpretation later. For someone whose entire professional identity rested on authority that had never once been questioned, this wasn't a minor inconvenience. Losing a title can be reframed, absorbed, folded into a story that flatters the person who lost it. Keeping a title while its actual power quietly and permanently shrinks around you, in full view of the colleagues, clients, and board members whose respect you spent years building, is an entirely different kind of reckoning. Marsh Dynamics, meanwhile, started drawing industry attention. Daniel turned down conversations with Ashworth's biggest direct competitors, understanding that competing against the company during the transition window wasn't legally sound and wasn't how he operated anyway. He signed 3 carefully scoped partnerships with mid-sized freight and logistics firms, each structured to avoid any direct overlap with Ashworth. He hired 2 engineers, signed a lease on a modest office outside the city, and built the next chapter of his company with the same quiet, methodical care he'd brought to everything else: no drama, no need for anyone to validate it, no apparent need for an audience at all. The final commercial agreement between Ashworth and Marsh Dynamics was a straightforward licensing contract negotiated at arm's length between 2 fully independent companies, with no employment relationship folded into it and no informal understanding standing in for written terms. Daniel's legal team set the framework. The licensing fee reflected what Meridian was actually worth to Ashworth's infrastructure, not the discounted rate baked into the old arrangement where employment and licensing had been tangled together for 6 years. Every intellectual property clause was unambiguous: all rights to Meridian belonged to Marsh Dynamics, full stop, with no path to acquisition. The support and development terms were specific, binding, and entirely separate from whatever goodwill used to live in the informal space between a director and the company that employed him. Renee reviewed the agreement for Ashworth and recommended signing it, because building or sourcing a real replacement for Meridian while also managing a client confidence crisis wasn't realistic on any timeline the board would accept. The day the contract was signed, Victoria made sure she was in the room, though no one had asked her to be. She wasn't there to sign. This was a commercial deal between the company and an outside vendor, and her role was operational. She sat at the table and watched Daniel review the final document page by page, sign it with the same old fountain pen he'd packed out of his desk that October, and set the pen down beside the page. His lawyer collected the signed copies. Victoria looked at the signature block at the bottom of the last page: Daniel Marsh, founder, Marsh Dynamics. The man she'd watched eat lunch alone at his desk for 6 years. The man whose schedule requests she'd approved with the particular silence of someone holding a leash was now sitting across the table as a vendor her company was contractually required to pay. She had nothing to say. For once, in a room where she'd spent years making sure she was always the one with something definitive to say, she simply had nothing. Months passed. Ashworth Logistics kept operating, and it's worth being clear, this was never a story about a company falling apart. 2 of the 3 major contracts renewed under the new terms. The third extended its timeline instead of walking away, which was close enough to a resolution. What had changed was less visible than a number on a balance sheet, but far more lasting: clear, documented proof that the person running the company had confused the authority she held with any real understanding of where its value actually came from. Victoria stayed in her role. Still wealthy, still connected, still someone whose last name opened doors that stayed shut for everyone else. But now every major decision came with a layer of oversight she hadn't chosen and couldn't remove. A permanent, structural reminder of what one sentence in a conference room had ultimately cost her. Daniel came back to the building one last time to finish the official transition paperwork, a legal formality, a few final signatures closing out the chapter. He took the elevator up to the 32nd floor, walked through the space where he'd worked for 6 years, and past his old desk. Someone new had claimed it, rearranged it, added a small plant to the corner, made it theirs the way people naturally do with borrowed space. Daniel looked at it for a moment without breaking stride. He continued into the conference room, signed the last document with his old pen, capped it, and turned back toward the elevator. Victoria saw him from the far end of the hallway. She watched him go and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that the past several months hadn't already said more clearly than any conversation between them ever could. She'd believed, without question, that what kept Daniel Marsh in his chair all those years was the accumulated weight of everything he owed. She'd been completely wrong. What had kept him there far longer than the situation deserved was loyalty. Something no compensation package can manufacture and no power imbalance can force. She'd ended it with a single sentence, and the full cost of that sentence would live on in every approval she now had to seek before acting, in every contract that carried his name as a counterparty above her own, and in the quiet at the end of a long hallway that now held nothing but the memory of what her contempt had thrown away.